Thanks for downloading Analysis. In the first of a new series, David AARONVITCH examines allegations of child sexual abuse and traces the intellectual influences behind society's shift from wrongful denial to excessive credulity.
If you'd walked 15 or 20 yards from my front door a few Sundays ago, this is what you would have heard.
What about the babies that have been murdered?
Stop killing babies!
These were demonstrators apparently convinced that the local church and the primary school that adjoins it had been the scene of organised satanic ritual abuse of children. Videoed recordings of a brother and sister at the school, which made a series of lurid allegations, had been widely circulated on the internet. There were supposedly secret passages used by parents, teachers and clergy to venues where babies would be sacrificed. The members of the cult ate baby meat prepared at McDonald's and wore shoes made of baby skin. The case was the subject of a Radio 4 documentary a few weeks ago, and listeners heard that it was all nonsense. It had all been made up. Despite this, campaigners who circulated the names, phone numbers and email addresses of alleged cult members repeated the mantra, "We believe the children."
Satanist.
Is she their mistress?
He's a Satanist, yeah. Child killer.
This time, no one in the mainstream media was biting. Today, the idea of ritual abuse is less fashionable, while the notion of murderous rings of paedophile politicians is far more current. But to me, there is a consistent ideological thread that runs through both phenomena, a tendency to allow stories to outstrip the facts, obscuring genuine abuse and creating an atmosphere in which false or mistaken accusations can flourish, to the detriment often of the very people who most need help. To explore how such ideas gain currency and what they mean, we're devoting 2 consecutive editions of Analysis to the linked subjects of recovered memory and a belief in widespread organised satanic and ritual abuse of children. Both gained wide acceptance in the late 80s and 90s among police, social workers and even journalists.
I was working as a reporter at the Independent on Sunday. It was March 1990 and the NSPCC had a press conference to launch their annual report. And at the press conference they came out with a briefing paper which referred for the first time to this ritual abuse, and 1 or 2 documents I think said satanic abuse. This was the first time a national charity had gone claiming that there was this new and horrendous form of child abuse that everyone needed to be on the lookout for. It made the whole story mainstream.
Rosie Waterhouse became one of the very few journalists to actively investigate the reality of the phenomenon of ritual abuse.
Imagine you've got an organisation as respected as the NSPCC. They're going to be taken seriously, and the media, without exception initially, was entirely credulous, including my own paper. I was tasked, along with another reporter, to look at the following Sunday's paper, what's the evidence for the existence of satanic ritual child abuse.
A certain credulity was understandable. Over the last 30 years, we've learned some dispiriting things about ourselves when it comes to the abuse of children. It happened, we often ignored it. One by one, institutions have been indicted for tolerating, or at the very least not punishing, abuse by their members and officers. Churches, boarding schools, children's homes, the BBC, and of course the family have been implicated in that most basic breach of trust, the sexual exploitation of minors. In many situations, such as those exploited by the gangs who groomed young teenagers, complaints by the victims were disbelieved or not taken seriously. Unsurprisingly, some of those whose job it was to help such youngsters began to correct such prejudices by a stance of more uncritical belief. In not a few cases, this mutated into a settled determination to find that there had been sexual abuse. The importance of corroborative evidence began to be overlooked. The dangers in such an overcorrection have always bothered me almost as much as the dangers of abuse. And to illustrate that, I've looked at the extraordinary spread of the belief in ritual abuse. The result of that spread was a vicious cycle of accusation, confabulation, excessive credulity and injustice, all of which, when it collapsed, led to a new period of disbelieving victims. The object of these programmes, then, is to show how an idea, a belief, began in America, how it crossed the Atlantic, how it bewitched a generation of childcare professionals, and how it caused, and still causes, long-term damage to the welfare of vulnerable children in Britain. And if listeners think they spot parallels with some of the current claims being made about VIP paedophile rings and group child murder, then all I can say is I agree. But this story begins with a film.
They all have names, and they come here and they protect you. They keep your appointments, and they're the ones who pour out this information that you're afraid to face. You've got to understand.
No, it's not true.
It's true.
It's not true.
Sybil was the hugely popular 1976 film of the book, published 3 years earlier, purporting to be the true story of a woman possessed by 16 personalities. American psychiatrist Cornelia Wilbur discovers Sybil's so-called alters during hundreds of hours of therapy and makes the diagnosis of multiple personality disorder.
Can you remember what's underneath it, sweetie?
I'm scared. I'm scared. Oh.
6 million read the book. Millions more, including me, saw the film and witnessed the moment when the underlying trauma causing the condition was finally revealed.
What does Mama have to do?
She's got me tied up on the table. Oh, it's so cold.
Harrowing. At least I thought so at the time. But I didn't investigate the Sybil case. American journalist and writer Debbie Nathan, however, did.
The theory of multiple personality disorder is based on the idea that something really, really terrible happened to you when you were a small child. Almost always a really terrible sexual crime. Really terrible, almost beyond the imagination of this culture. And that it was so awful that you kind of walled it off, the memory, into another personality who would take over that memory from you and protect you from it. And so if you were diagnosed as having multiple personality disorder, the hunt immediately began for the terrible thing that had happened to you, and the hunt began for the memory.
Such a memory, often involving extreme childhood sexual abuse, was said to be recovered. But for this new diagnosis to become respectable, it had to be given an official stamp of approval. In 1980, it was, when it was officially listed by the American Psychiatric Association in its Diagnostic Statistical Manual.
In the late 1970s, the therapist whose patient was Sybil started really politicking to get multiple personality disorder into the DSM. And she was successful, along with a small group of other people who really believed that multiple personality disorder was an objective mental illness, and they got that diagnosis into the DSM. It's used by mental health practitioners who diagnose people in this country with mental health problems. It's a very important document because it has these little 6-digit classifications, and you have to give a classification to a patient in order to get an insurance reimbursement. And that's when the diagnosis really, really ballooned.
Before 1980, there had been around 200 documented cases of MPD. By 1986, that figure had risen to 6,000. For many practitioners in the field of therapy, it's a diagnosis, now renamed dissociative identity disorder, or DID, that is still valid. Sue Hampson worked with abuse survivors and is director of the Safe to Say training and consultancy organisation, and believes that DID is a genuine condition.
It's an excellent coping mechanism, and usually people who have DID, it used to be called multiple personalities, it's when things are so bad that an alter comes in and helps protect them in terms of the abuse and the pain that goes on. So it's very much a really effective coping mechanism that gets them through the abuse in that way.
So you believe that there are and always have been people out there with something that we might used to have called multiple personalities, or they actually have several personalities inside themselves who split off in order to help them cope with trauma.
Yes, I've worked with people, yes. I've had extraordinary experiences of that when I used to know by the way that the gate was shut when I had a private practice which personality was coming that day. Some people smoke, some people don't, and it's the same person we're talking about, but they fulfilled a very important role in that person's life as they were going through the abuse.
This view is, these days, deeply controversial. But back in the late 70s, it was still new. And one of those who, in therapy, supposedly remembered having been abused was a Canadian woman called Michelle. And what she recalled was almost beyond horrific.
On the cloak was a bedpan. The nurse gave Michelle an enema, and when the child could wait no longer, the nurse led her over, forced her to squat down, and then yanked the bedpan away and flipped aside part of the cloak. The child found herself hopelessly defecating on the floor, but on the floor, where the cloak and bedpan had been, were a crucifix and a Bible. When Michelle saw that she had soiled them, she was horrified.
The whole idea of satanic ritual abuse, the first mention of such a phenomenon was in a book called Michelle Remembers, published in America in 1980. It was published here in 1981.
Journalist Rosie Waterhouse again.
This was written by Michelle Smith and her psychiatrist, who she later married, in which this purports to be a true sort of misery memoir of how Michelle was a victim of a satanic cult 20 years earlier, and all sorts of vile things were alleged to have happened to her, including being put in a pit with snakes and abused, and only recovered these memories in therapy. And there was a sort of convergence of believers in the therapy movement in recovering memories of abuse, with those who came to believe that some of this abuse was in satanic cults. And there was a crossover.
Michelle Smith had gone into therapy after suffering a miscarriage. She came out with a raft of new memories of horrific sexual and, in her case, satanic abuse. And this would become common. Roma Hart was stressed out. As a single working mum, she just wanted a sick note so that she could stay off work. Within 15 minutes of a consultation with a psychiatrist, she'd been diagnosed as having MPD, multiple personality disorder.
Well, he first started off by asking me if I'd ever been abused as a child. I'd grown up in a very stern household with very strict disciplinary parents. They were in the Army, Air Force, but they'd never sexually abused me. So I just told him no, that I had not.
And what did he say?
He said, well, it's normal for people with repressed memories not to remember their abuse. If you say no, that means yes to him.
Within the space of just 3 months, Roma had recovered all kind of fantastical details. Her psychiatrist said she had 52 different personalities, all of them created to protect her conscious self from the memory of the abuse to which she'd been subjected.
In the beginning, it was sexual abuse by my parents. And then it was sexual abuse by aunts and uncles and cousins and brothers. And all the family members were implicated because apparently they all belonged to a satanic cult, murderous satanic cult. Then it progressed within a matter of weeks to where I had given birth to a half-alien baby.
All this happens very quickly, Roma, and the things which you are agreeing to believe are right at the far edge of what it is a human being could be brought to believe. How would you explain that?
Well, the first thing I can say is the way I was brought up, to be obedient and to trust doctors completely. So even though my brain is just screaming at me that this is total utter nonsense, my brain is also saying this is a world-class doctor. He must know what's right, and obviously you're crazy.
Roma's therapy in Canada came not long after the book Michelle Remembers went stratospheric. Michelle's psychiatrist, and subsequently her husband, was a man called Lawrence Pasda. He was a fellow of the Canadian Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, and his status helped confer respectability on his claims that the infant Michelle had been the victim of a satanic cult. It was not long before Pasda's expertise was required by Californian investigators in a case that was to lead to the longest and most expensive criminal trial in US history. In 1983, a child at the McMartin preschool apparently told his mother that he had been sexually abused there by her estranged husband and by a teacher. The authorities then put out a request that other parents question their children to see if they too might have been abused. Several hundred were subsequently interviewed at a Los Angeles abuse therapy clinic, and now dozens of allegations were made about 7 people connected with the school. Debbie Nathan.
All of a sudden, they were being accused of being part of a secret satanic cult and of having abused literally hundreds of children by doing things like taking them to mortuaries, funeral homes, to churches, flying them in airplanes to very faraway places, slaughtering animals in front of them, stabbing them in their genitals with implements, putting them in tunnels, marching them through tunnels underground. It was absolutely astounding and incredible what they were being accused of.
The McMartin case lasted 6 years. As it was going on, Debbie Nathan was assigned to cover a very similar scandal in Texas. What she discovered was an absurd degree of credulity on the part of the authorities. Even basic issues such as whether children could have been moved around in the ways alleged within the timing stated were not properly investigated.
I could see that this was logistically impossible. And I thought, why would a jury believe this? And there were so many things like that the kids didn't have any wounds on them, despite the fact that this had gone on for months and they were being assaulted by weapons that would have made them bleed severely and probably need surgery. So it didn't make any sense.
The McMartin trial culminated in 1990 with the acquittal of all those charged, one of whom has spent 5 years in prison. During its course, angry parents had even dug underneath the preschool looking for the secret tunnels where their children had allegedly been abused. There were none. And by now, after a period of madness, the satanic panic was receding in the States.
So many people started in therapy accusing their parents and relatives of being in satanic cults and doing the most terrible things to them. It just got to be too big. It was like the witch hunt, Salem witch trials in the United States, and doubts started to arise and lawsuits started to be brought against therapists by parents who'd been accused by their children in therapy, their adult children.
The occult flame, however, was kept alive beyond the shores of America. Kept aflame not least by what might be called the 4 key validating texts of recovered memory and ritual abuse: Sybil, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, Michelle Remembers, and possibly the most influential of all, The Courage to Heal. These 4 publications were the subject of a doctoral thesis by journalist Rosie Waterhouse.
The Courage to Heal became known as the Bible of the recovered memory movement, and that combined the notions of satanic abuse, recovered memory therapy, and multiple personality disorder. And it made all of those concepts mainstream, and that book had massive circulation, became an absolute bestseller.
The Courage to Heal was not written by therapists, but by a feminist poet and her student who had recovered memories of childhood incest while in therapy. It was published in 1988.
It was positively encouraging any, usually females, who had anything at all wrong with them, usually mental health problem, could be anything from anorexia to postnatal depression, to consider the possibility that the root cause of that problem was that they'd been sexually abused as a child. And the whole mantra throughout it was it didn't leave open any possibility that abuse had not occurred.
Many women don't have memories, and some never get memories. This doesn't mean they weren't abused. If you don't have a memory of it, it can be hard to believe the abuse really happened. If you are unable to remember any specific instances, but still have a feeling that something abusive happened to you, it probably did.
It's hard to overestimate how important The Courage to Heal, with its empathic tone, its graphic content, and its self-help ethos became. Anyone, anywhere could understand it. So even before the McMartin trial had come to its anticlimax, the ideas of repressed memory and ritual abuse had crossed the Atlantic and found surprisingly fertile soil in supposedly phlegmatic Britain. The seeds were generally planted in that hothouse for new intellectual plants, the professional conference. Where social workers and children's services came together to discuss what was new in their business, the terrible but nevertheless indisputable truth about ritual abuse was told to them. Rosie Waterhouse subsequently tracked the progress of an idea.
How it actually came to the UK is a combination of people from the UK going to the States and picking up all this latest state-of-the-art knowledge, literature, and people from the States coming to the UK. Is the conference circuit. One of the earliest conferences in the UK was in Reading, in 1989, just before it all broke here with the NSPCC. Social workers from Nottingham were in attendance. They were claiming that a vile case of incest that they'd come across in Nottingham was actually satanic. It might seem just incredible to think that individuals could have such influence, but they did. I mean, they were sort of treated like superstars on the conference circuit, and literature was just passed around.
The Nottingham case became crucial. In October 1987, several children of an extended family in Nottinghamshire had been removed from their home on the Broxtowe Council estate on suspicion that they had been sexually abused by their parents and other relatives. The children had certainly been the victims of appalling sexual abuse, and in February 1989, 10 adults were jailed, found guilty of 53 offences of incest, indecent assault and cruelty. There was no mention of any satanic element in the abuse during the trial. Those allegations came later, as one attendee at those early meetings, anthropologist Jean Lafontaine, who'd studied African witchcraft beliefs, can testify.
The conference appeared to be a mixture of social workers and religious leaders of various sorts, and some psychiatrists, some child psychiatrists. And then there was this staggering piece of information about devil worship in Nottingham. A few people sitting next to me said, why Nottingham? But I thought, why devil worship? What was being said was that children should be listened to, and they were saying, these stories the children have been telling us sound utterly incredible, but you have to believe them.
It does seem extraordinary to think that something as implausible as children and babies and animals being sacrificed and blood being drunk and snakes and pointy hats, in this day and age people could believe it, but they did.
Rosie Waterhouse. And the audience was apparently spellbound, and not just those who attended. Broadcasters were far from immune to the idea that something terrible and almost incredible was going on, as here on Heart of the Matter in July 1990, when Joan Bakewell's programme included an interview with the Nottingham social worker Christine Johnston.
Children started to talk about the master who came and hurt them, or about going to parties where they had to drink blood, and activities took place around sexual abuse, but using objects to hurt the children, like inserting snakes into their bottoms or inserting worms. And so the form of abuse took on a much more bizarre feature than we'd heard of before, really.
There was one group in particular that found the notion of a satanic presence easier to process than others. The upsurge in interest in ritual abuse coincided with a growth in evangelical Christian churches in Britain. A literal belief in Satan helped the evangelical movement to become an enthusiastic part of the campaign to warn people about the dangers of the ritual corruption of children.
All around the world, there's been an increase in the practice of spiritism, fortune-telling, witchcraft and Satanism.
In 1990, for example, a group of evangelicals produced a video, a greater undertaking in those days than it is now, under the heading of Christian Response to the Occult. One of those interviewed for the video would have been familiar to the social worker conference circuit.
My name's Judith Dawson, and I'm a child abuse consultant from Nottinghamshire Social Services.
So here was Judith Dawson, she's now Judith Jones, appearing in an evangelical Christian video warning the British public of the dangers of Satanism.
We've had to be taken beyond belief, because what we've learned is that children are not only sexually abused in some families, but that they're also ritualistically abused. That means that some adults get involved with satanic groups whose main aim is to destroy everything that's good about human life and human values. As you're probably aware, Christ said, "Touch not one hair of this child's head." Satanists believe that they should do the opposite of that.
Dawson felt she was speaking from experience. Together with a number of other child protection workers, notably Christine Johnston, she was then in the middle of the Nottingham case, in which ritual abuse seemed to her to play a major part. Tim Tate, a journalist and writer who'd written about child pornography, took an interest in what had happened to the children of Broxtowe.
They had been taken into care and were living in foster homes. They had little or no contact with each other, and the foster parents were asked to record what the children said about the abuse they had suffered. And the foster parents did so without contact with each other, to the best of my knowledge, and they did so either by recording it on tape, or by writing it down verbatim, or by keeping diaries. Early on, once the children felt safe, they began describing the abuse, and they then went on to describe abuse which was not purely sexual in nature, but which was taking place in large groups, in which there was chanting, there were robes, there were knives, there were candles, and in which, so they said, children or babies were killed.
And so when you went and heard these stories, presumably you thought to yourself, that's interesting.
I never met or spoke with the children themselves, quite rightly, but I did have access to the recordings, the verbatim pages, and the diaries of some of the foster parents. What those showed was a type of abuse which was very different to, forgive the phrase, garden variety sexual abuse of children.
So struck was Tate by the case that he embarked both on making television programmes and writing a book, Children for the Devil, Ritual Abuse and Satanic Crime, about what was seemingly being uncovered. For the new allegations went far beyond the abuse charges levelled at the extended family and appeared to implicate possibly dozens of others, Tim Tate's large groups, in child sexual abuse during satanic rituals. Nottingham social worker Christine Johnston told Joan Bakewell about it on BBC One's Heart of the Matter programme in July 1990.
We've looked at every explanation that there could be other than ritual abuse, and at the end of the day we're left saying it can only be ritual abuse. And if the children here have experienced this and are talking about this, and children elsewhere and in America and Europe are saying the same things, there's got to be something happening.
But if this something is true, what your evidence amounts to is a nationwide, worldwide network of appalling behaviour.
Torture of children, yes.
So that is what you are alleging?
Yes. Unbelievable, isn't it?
Indeed, it was unbelievable. And, as we'll discover next week, it was also untrue.
That edition of Analysis was presented by David AARONVITCH of The Times and produced by me, Hannah Barnes. The second part of the programme can be heard next week.